Hello and welcome to this video on making autumnal and winter beer, which would properly be called a lager. Of the typical beer varieties available, you're going to largely see ale. This is called by either typical ale, Indian pale ale, or IPA and so on. Less common, but the other major cluster of beer is lager. Where ale is made with light malt and plenty of hops, a lager is far less so. In fact, ale is made when the weather is warmer and refreshing. This means the spiciness of the hops is, refreshing rather obviously. A lager is made when the weather is cold, mostly in autumn, but modern conditions of houses and similar mean winter is just as viable. This is because they are brewed at low to teen temperatures. Once brewed, they are often far less hopped and then stored at a low temperature to age. This creates a relatively heavy beer with strong mature flavours. It is rather stark in contrast to ale, which is generally going to be at least somewhat more hoppy and generally going to be slightly darker, although this will vary considerably based on what you're making. We'll work to the most common type of lager in this video, a pilsner. A pilsner is a pale lager. It's generally going to have a much more crisp taste compared to some of the others, and it's also, as mentioned, generic for all lagers, lightly hopped. Its name originates in the town of Pilsen, which is now in the Czech Republic, hence its name Pilsner. We can try a range of yeasts for this, and you may want to choose your own preferred choice of lager yeast to brew your Pilsner, but some options include the Imperial Harvest, Imperial Urquell, Omega's American Lager, American Pilsner, Bayern's Lager, German Lager, or Saft Lager 3470, S189, or S23. There are, of course, as mentioned, other options, and you're free to use what you're most comfortable with. For this, we will be using a all-grain mix. So we'll start with roughly 10 litres of water, although you can vary the recipe to suit your sizes. But assuming a 10-litre batch, add this to a large pot or kettle and heat the water. You want to add your grains to this until it reaches somewhere around 60-ish degrees. Let them sit for about half an hour, so that the enzymes within it can take action, primarily thinking of the amylases here. Then remove your grains or filter them out using a large mesh screen. Then after this, you want to transfer all of the liquid, but none of the remaining content of the grains, so you don't want to let them drip dry. You literally want to pour as much as you can off as is, and then transfer the grains elsewhere. Once you now have what is effectively an extract, you now want to look at adding anything else you're going to add to this. Whether it's something like those light hops, and your choice of hops will vary based on your personal preferences, and you want to heat this for a time. A part of that is simply to, add the other ingredients and make sure they're all dissolved within, but also to extract those hop flavors. This will darken the beer considerably. It's also why you don't need to heat this for anywhere near as long. Once you have achieved the extract, you want to bring it to a boil, and part of this is to, deactivate the yeasts to some extent. It also allows you to dissolve any pure malt extract you're going to be using. If you want to ensure a stronger hop flavour, it's suggested to add them again now as the wash is beginning to, cool down, let's say. This will help considerably in extracting the flavours, as it's hot enough to extract them, but not so hot as to boil them off. Common hop varieties used are going to be something like Miltfra, Czech Sass, Tettnanger, Simcoe. There are a variety of others available. Of those we've mentioned, the Miltfra is going to create a more herbal and spicy flavour. The Sass will have a slight spice and almost pine-like scent to it. The Tettnanger will be spicy and somewhat more fruity, and the Simcoe will have a pine-like resin smell to it, along with a degree of fruity and citrus scents, although of these we do generally advise to err towards the less, fruity options. That's because they tend to be dulled somewhat over the aging time. Once your water is prepared and you've boiled and cooled it down, we now need to set it to a side and, wait for it to cool the rest of the way. Specifically, we're working towards somewhere around 14 to 15 degrees Celsius. And no freezing units for you this time. This will then lead to your primary fermentation. You want to add your yeast to this. Now, you can pitch a dry yeast into it if you so wish, or you can prepare a yeast solution that you'll add to it. Either one works, but these are your options. You'll need to wait anywhere up to 2 weeks for fermentation to finish. After the primary fermentation is completed, transfer it to a secondary fermentation vessel. This will also be where you may or may not wish to add more hops again. The hops will be useful in this case to ensure again the flavour by double hopping. You also want to ensure that any of the remaining sugars are fermented if you want a drier beer. At the end of this time, you should have most of the sugars dropping out of suspension that aren't able to stay that way because it's a cool environment. You want to put your fermenter in a cool place now if it isn't already. This would be traditionally the lagering process or cellaring. You obviously may not have a cellar nowadays, but as mentioned, so long as your house is not exceptionally warm over winter, it should be cool enough. Again, we're talking somewhere around low teens, if ideally below 10 degrees Celsius, but in reality this can be a challenge, so take what you can, and if you are inclined, consider having a dedicated fridge for this. After this time, you are just going to have to ignore it. Unfortunately, that's what it is. The cellaring process or lagering process can take up to 6 months, which is a particularly long process, but obviously you don't want that. And under ideal circumstances, you can cut it down to as little as a month or 2. Anything less than a month, and you're likely to find that it hasn't really changed at all, and that 2-month window is probably the ideal range. You can go a little bit earlier, and later is, well, rather obviously better. After you've finished your lagering process, you now want to go on and carbonate it. We do suggest bottle carbonating, but it's your choice as to how you want to do this. You can always put it in something like a keg, and then use pure CO2. Bottle carbonating is our preference simply because it's slightly more practical. You take your lager, you distribute it amongst bottles evenly, you add your priming sugar according to the volume of the bottle, seal them and wait a week, and now it should be carbonated and able to be consumed quite satisfactorily. This should result in premium quality. Well, honestly, better quality than most domestic beers, and certainly something you can enjoy more. You may not want to share your first lager batch, or probably first few, but it is somewhat more forgiving given the aging process. The lagering will mellow out some of the more offensive flavours and errors that you make. This leads to a more enjoyable beer, and as mentioned, it's something you can do over winter, given the cooler environment that you're currently experiencing. However, come summer, it doesn't really work, largely because the lagering process just isn't possible, and it's why there's a drastic shift from something like an ale to a lager in winter, and from a lager into an ale come summer. Thank you for watching this video. If you found it interesting, consider liking, sharing, and subscribing. Please do post any comments, questions, or suggestions you have below.